Halvor Bakke had not eaten in 2 days, and neither had his children, when he stopped his wagon at the gate of the Vance ranch, and did the thing he had promised himself back in Christiania he would never do. He begged. The woman who came to the door was not old, though the ranch made her seem older than her years. Margit Vance was 34, a former schoolteacher from Ohio who had married a rancher named Elias Vance and buried him 3 winters back, when a fever took him in the space of 9 days. She had kept the place running since with 2 hired hands who had, the autumn before, taken half a season's wages and left the west pasture fence down and the root cellar half dug before the ground froze. She had learned, the hard way, that a man's promises and a man's work were 2 different animals, and she had stopped extending credit to the first in favor of judging only the second. She looked at Halvor Bakke, a big man gone thin, his coat too light for the season, 2 children behind him in the wagon bed wrapped in what looked like the last of a good wool blanket, and she did not soften, because softening in her experience was how a person got robbed. "I have no work," she said. "I am not asking for work," Halvor said. His English was careful, learned in a shipyard in Bergen and sharpened on a decade of American docks before the yards closed and sent him west looking for land that never quite became his. "I am asking for milk, for my children. I will fix your ranch in return. Whatever you say is broken, I will look at it." Margit Vance had heard variations of this sentence 3 times in 3 years, always from men who could not fix a hinge, let alone a barn. She almost closed the door. What stopped her was not pity. She distrusted pity in herself as much as she distrusted promises in others, but a practical calculation. The barn was, in fact, broken, in ways she did not have the coin to hire out before winter, and a man who ate nothing and worked 1 day would cost her less than a man she paid up front and lost. "1 week," she said. "You and the children can sleep in the granary loft. Milk twice a day for them, same as I give my own hands. If your work isn't worth the milk, you're gone at the end of it, and I keep whatever tools you've used for my trouble." "Fair," Halvor said, and meant it, and did not tell her that he had, 12 years before, apprenticed 4 years under a master joiner in Bergen who had also trained him in the old turf and timber building methods of the fjord country. Methods that had nothing to do with American balloon frame carpentry, and everything to do with keeping a structure alive through a winter that tried every year to kill it. The Vance barn, when Halvor walked it the next morning with his breath smoking in front of him, told him everything about the 3 years since Elias Vance had died. It was a good barn in its bones, heavy timber frame, sound sills, a design meant for a colder climate than most Americans building in the territory had bothered with. But it had been neglected exactly where neglect costs the most. The chinking between the lower log courses on the north wall had dried and fallen out in fist-sized gaps, so that a man standing inside could see daylight low along the wall where the cattle stood at night. The hay mow above had a section of roof boards cupped and split from 2 summers without pitch seal, and Halvor could see, without climbing, where snow had gotten in the winter before and left a dark water stain running down the inside of the north gable. Worst of all in his eye was the door. Someone, Elias, most likely in his last autumn, had hung a second door inside the main one, a crude attempt to double the barrier against the wind, and had caulked every seam of both doors and the wall around them with mud daub, sealed tight as a jar. Margit watched him from the yard, arms crossed, expecting him to talk about paint, or a new door, or hired lumber she could not afford. Instead, he stood a long time just looking at the sealed inner door, and then he asked her a question that surprised her. "When the cattle come in from a cold night, do you see frost on their ears, on the inside walls?" She had, in fact, seen exactly that every hard morning for 2 winters, and had never thought of it as anything but the ordinary cruelty of winter. "Some," she said. "Why?" "Because the barn cannot breathe," Halvor said. "You have made it a box. A sealed box with animals in it breathing all night makes water in the air. The water finds the cold wood and freezes there, on the ears, on the walls. This is not the cold coming in. This is the wet staying in and turning to ice." It was not what she expected to hear, and she did not believe it yet, but she noted, privately, that it was the first specific thing any hired man had told her in 3 years that sounded like it came from knowledge rather than excuse. Halvor's first days were spent doing what any competent frontier carpenter would have done, and this was deliberate. He did not want to spend the trust he had not yet earned on methods she had never seen. He rechinked the worst gaps in the log wall with a mud and straw daub mixed the way every homesteader in the territory mixed it, tamped it in with a flat stick, and let it begin to dry in the pale autumn sun. He replaced 11 roof boards on the mow roof, resetting them with the crown side up so rain would shed rather than pool. And he rehung the barn's main door on new leather hinges so it no longer dragged and left a gap at the bottom. It looked like good, honest work, and Margit, checking it in the evenings with a lantern, allowed herself to think that perhaps this one would last the week. Then the first real freeze came, 9 nights into his stay, and in the morning half the new mud chinking had cracked and fallen away from the log wall in dinner plate-sized flakes, leaving the gaps worse than before, because now there was frost-heaved debris in the wall cavity as well as open air. Halvor stood looking at it before dawn, and Margit, coming out to the barn with her lantern and finding him already there, felt the old, familiar disappointment rising in her chest. Here it comes, she thought, the excuses, but what he said instead was, "This mud is wrong for this wall. I built it the way the wall wanted last week. I should have built it the way the wall needs for the winter that is coming." Meaning mud shrinks when it dries and shrinks more when it freezes. Every log wall in this country moves a little with the cold. The wood itself pulls tight. A chink that is only mud has nothing to hold it while the wood moves. It cracks like a plate dropped on a stone floor. He crouched and picked up a fallen piece, crumbling it between his fingers. "Where I trained, on the fjord, we did not use only mud. We used moss first, packed tight into the gap as a cushion, and mud over the moss as a skin. The moss holds its shape when the wood moves. The mud just protects the moss from wind and rain." Margit had never heard of chinking a wall with moss, and her first instinct, the instinct of a woman who had been burned before, was that this was exactly the kind of thing a man said when he wanted more time and did not want to admit a mistake. "And where," she asked, not unkindly but pointedly, "do you propose to find moss in November on a cattle ranch in the territory?" It was a fair question, and it very nearly ended the arrangement there, because Halvor did not have a ready answer standing in the yard that morning. But he had noticed, in his first week walking the property to understand its water and its wood, a low boggy stretch along the creek behind the north pasture where sphagnum moss grew thick over half-submerged deadfall, kept wet by a spring that never fully froze. It was not identical to the moss of the fjord country, but its structure, the way it held air within itself, the way it resisted rot when kept dry after harvesting, was close enough that Halvor's hands, trained to judge such things, told him it would serve. He spent 2 full days hauling moss from the creek bank in feed sacks, spreading it on the granary roof to dry in what sun there was, and Margit, watching a man who was supposed to be repairing her barn instead disappear to a creek bed with sacks, came closer than she had yet to sending him off the property. What stopped her again was calculation rather than faith. He had not asked for anything beyond the milk already agreed, and the week was not yet up. When he rechinked the wall a second time, moss packed firm into every gap with a wooden paddle he had shaped himself from a barrel stave. Then a thin skin of mud and manure daub troweled over the top. A mixture he explained held better than mud alone because the manure's fiber worked the same cushioning trick as straw, only finer. The work looked, to Margit's eye, almost identical to the first attempt. She said as much. "It will not look different until the freeze," Halvor said. "It will feel different in 10 years, but you do not have 10 years to wait to know if I am honest. You will know in one hard freeze." The hard freeze came within the week, and the wall held no cracking, no fallen daub, the moss compressing slightly with the wood's movement rather than fighting it. Margit inspected it in the frostlit morning with her bare hand pressed to the chinking, feeling for the cold draft that had always found her palm in past winters and found none. It was a small thing. It was also the first time in 3 years that anything on the ranch had been fixed and stayed fixed, and she did not say so to Halvor, but she began, that morning, to watch his work rather than merely check it. The moisture problem, though, was not solved by the wall alone, and this was the deeper discovery Halvor had been circling since his first morning in the barn. He had sealed the worst air leaks, which was correct. But 3 nights after the wall held, Margit found frost thick on the inside north gable again, and 2 of the milk cows with ice crusted delicately along the fine hairs of their ears, and she came to the granary loft before light, angry in the particular quiet way of a person who feels foolish for having started to trust. "You told me the wet stays in when the barn is sealed too tight," she said. "You have now sealed it tighter, and the frost is worse." It was, Halvor realized, standing in the dark barn with his lantern raised to the gable, the truest thing she could have said to him, and it forced him to admit, first to himself, then to her, that he had made the same mistake as the man before him, only with better materials. He had chinked every gap in the walls. He had hung the door tight. He had made the barn, in his eagerness to stop the cold air, a better sealed box than it had ever been, and a sealed box with 8 cattle breathing in it all night, each animal putting perhaps 2 quarts of water vapor into the air across a long winter night, had nowhere for that moisture to go but the coldest surfaces it could find, the underside of the roof boards, the north gable, the fine hairs of an ear pressed near a wall. In the old country, Halvor said slowly, working it through as he spoke, the good barns were never sealed all the way. There was always a gap left on purpose, high at the ridge where the warm, wet air rises and can leave before it turns to frost. I sealed your walls because your walls were the wound I saw first. I did not think about the roof breathing until the walls stopped bleeding. He looked up at the tight new roofline, every board snug, not a gap in it. I made the same mistake twice in 2 different places, first with the mud, now with the whole barn. It would have been easy in that moment for Margit to conclude that his knowledge was theory dressed up as expertise, real enough to sound convincing and wrong enough to keep failing her. 3 years of hired men had taught her that confident explanation and correct execution were not the same thing, and a woman with 8 cattle and no money for replacements could not afford to keep learning that lesson at her herd's expense. She told him so, standing in the frozen dark, her voice flat with the specific exhaustion of a person doing arithmetic on how many more mistakes she could survive. "You have one more fix," she said. "Not one more idea, one more fix, and then this is finished because I cannot keep losing sleep to your education." Halvor did not sleep that night. He sat in the granary loft with his children breathing evenly beside him and turned the roofline over in his mind the way he had once turned a joint over in his hands in Bergen, looking for the place where the whole thing either held or failed. By the gray hour before dawn he had it, and it was not a grand solution. It was the kind of small, exact correction that only a man who had actually built these things before would think to make. He would not tear off what he had built. He would not risk more of Margit's patience on a second wholesale change. He would cut a single continuous gap along the ridge of the mow roof, no wider than the flat of 2 fingers, running the length of the barn, and cover it with a raised cap of board. What he called in his own head a smoke slit, though there was no smoke here, only breath and heat, so that warm, wet air rising off the cattle below would find a way out at the highest point before it ever reached the cold underside of the roof boards where it liked to freeze. The trick, he knew, was that the gap had to be shielded from direct wind and rain by the cap board above it, or he would simply be undoing every gain he had made against drafts at animal level. Warm air needed to leave from the top. Cold, wet weather needed to be kept from coming in the same way. He explained this to Margit at first light, sketching it with a charred stick on a barn board rather than trying to describe it in words alone, because he had learned in his first week that she trusted a drawing more than a promise. She studied it a long moment, arms crossed against the cold, and asked the question that told him she had, despite everything, begun to think like a builder herself. "If warm air leaves at the ridge," she said, "does cold air not come in behind it, somewhere lower, to replace it? You'll have solved the frost and started a new draft." It was, Halvor thought, exactly the right question, the same one his own master had once asked him in Bergen, and he told her so, which surprised her more than the answer itself. "Yes, but a little draft, low, moving slow, spread along the whole length of a wall the cattle are not pressed against, is not the same as the wet air with nowhere to go. Moving air that is dry does not frost your gable. Standing air that is wet does. I will leave a small vent low on the south wall, away from where the herd beds down, to let air in gently to replace what leaves at the ridge. The barn breathes in low and slow and breathes out high and steady, like a man sleeping, not a man in a doorway with the wind on him." Margit did not answer him for a long moment, standing in the cold with her breath fogging above the charcoal sketch, and then she said only, "Do it," and walked back toward the house before he could see whatever had crossed her face. He built the ridge vent in a single hard day of work, straddling the roof peak with numb hands, cutting the gap true with a rip saw borrowed from her tool shed, and capping it with boards scavenged from a collapsed corn crib at the property's edge, salvaged rather than requested, because he was still a guest and did not want to ask her for lumber he was not certain would earn its keep. He cut the low intake vent on the south wall that same evening, a simple hinged flap of board he could close entirely in the worst weather and crack open when the animal's breath fogged too thick in the lantern light. 3 nights later the temperature dropped harder than it had all season, the kind of cold that made the ranch's windows frost in ferns overnight and turned the water trough to a solid disk by morning. And Margit came to the barn before her hired hands were even awake, half expecting to find the whole experiment undone. What she found instead was a barn colder at the walls, by feel, than it had been in the false-sealed days before. She could sense, faintly, the low south draft moving near the floorboards, but with no frost on the north gable, no ice in the cattle's ear hair, and a stillness in the air above the animals that had a different quality to it, a used, breathed warmth rising and leaving rather than pooling and freezing. She said nothing to him about it that morning. She only stood a long while in the doorway with her lantern, watching her own breath and the herds mingle and drift up toward the ridge and out. And Halvor, watching her from across the barn, understood that this silence was worth more than any thanks she could have spoken. The 7th day came and went without either of them mentioning it. There was still the matter of the barn's structural weak points, which Halvor had catalogued in his first walkthrough and set aside as secondary to the moisture problem, and which became urgent again with the second week's work. The mow floor above the north stalls sagged visibly under the weight of stacked hay, its joists undersized for the load some earlier owner had asked of them, and Halvor judged, correctly, that a hard winter's accumulated hay weight combined with the vibration of cattle moving below could eventually bring the floor down into the stalls. Not a gradual failure, but a sudden one, the kind that killed animals outright rather than merely chilling them. He shored it with 2 new posts cut from seasoned, fence-line timber Margit had been saving for a project of her own. Cross-braced in a triangulated pattern, he had to explain twice before she saw why a straight post alone would not do what a braced one did. And this time she asked the right questions before he built rather than after, which told him something had shifted in how she weighed his judgment against her own doubt. By the 3rd week, Halvor Bakke had stopped being, in Margit Vance's private accounting, a beggar she was extracting labor from, and had become something closer to a foreman she had not yet found the courage to call by that word. She extended the arrangement without either of them formally renegotiating it. Milk continued. The granary loft stayed warm with a small stove Halvor built from a salvaged oil drum, and the work simply continued because stopping it had become unthinkable to both of them, for different reasons. Halvor's children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, began doing small chores around the yard without being asked, gathering eggs and hauling kindling, and Margit found herself, without quite deciding to, setting places for 4 at supper instead of leaving the newcomers to eat separately in the loft. The real test came in the 2nd week of January, when a storm system that the old-timers along the creek would speak of for a decade afterwards settled over the territory and did not move for 4 days. The temperature fell to 19 degrees below zero on the 2nd night and held there, with wind driving snow horizontally hard enough to strip bark dust off the north-facing fence posts. Margit's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Thomas Herrick who ran the largest herd in the valley and had in past years made a point of telling Margit kindly, but pointedly, that a widow alone could not be expected to hold a place like hers through a real winter, lost 11 head of cattle in that storm. Animals that froze standing in a barn built tight and dry by ordinary standards, sealed against the wind exactly the way every rancher in the territory had been taught to seal a barn. Margit's barn, breathing low and slow at the south wall and high and steady at the ridge, lost none. She and Halvor spent the worst of the 4 days largely inside it, checking the vent flap by lantern light, brushing frost from the animal's flanks where it gathered despite everything, keeping the water trough broken open with an iron bar so the herd would drink. On the 3rd night, with the wind screaming along the ridge cap Halvor had built, and the 2 of them sitting on overturned buckets in the relative stillness of the breathing barn, listening to 8 cattle chewing cud in the dark rather than shivering, Margit said the thing she had been turning over since the first failed chinking 3 months before. "I judged you the day you came to my door," she said. "I thought a man who begs is a man who has already failed at everything else, and I took your work because it cost me less than my pride would have cost me otherwise. I was wrong about what kind of man you were. I wasn't wrong to make you prove it." Halvor considered this a long moment, the lantern light moving on the moss and mud wall behind her, solid now, holding. "Where I come from," he said, "a man does not ask you to trust his word. He asks you to watch his hands and to judge him only by what the wall does in the freeze. You judged me exactly the right way. It was only that no one had asked you to watch a wall before. Now you have watched one, and you know what to look for with or without me." The storm broke on the 5th morning into a hard, clear cold. The sky scrubbed pale blue. The snow crusted thick enough to walk on without breaking through, and the valley's ranchers began the grim work of counting what the storm had taken. Thomas Herrick rode over 3 days later, ostensibly to see how Margit's herd had fared, and found Halvor on the roof resetting a shingle loosened by the wind, and found, standing in the barn beneath him, 8 cattle in good flesh and dry coats, not a frost mark on the gable, the low south draft still moving thin and steady along the floor. He asked, in the careful voice of a man revising an opinion he had held with some confidence, how she had managed it, and Margit told him plainly that she had not managed it alone, and gestured up at the roof, and did not further explain herself, because she had decided, sometime in the last 4 days, that she no longer needed Herrick's good opinion of her competence, only his acknowledgement of the barns. Halvor Bakke did not leave the Vance ranch that spring. There was no single dramatic conversation that settled it, no proposal delivered like the climax of a story. There was instead a slow accumulation of ordinary days in which leaving simply stopped being discussed, the way the ridge vent had stopped needing explanation once the barn had proven, through one brutal winter, exactly what it was for. He built her a smokehouse the following autumn using the same principle that had saved her herd, a controlled, shielded gap for what needed to leave, a modest, sheltered opening for what needed to enter. And when neighbors asked him where he had learned such things, he told them the truth, that he had learned them on a fjord and ocean away, in a country where the winter did not forgive an unfinished wall, and that the wall did not care where a man came from, or what he had been forced to beg for at some stranger's door. It only cared whether he understood in his hands what it needed to survive.